Good morning. My name is Erica Kirby, and I am the past chair of the Applied Communication Division, and it's in that role that I have planned for us our panel today in Applied Communication on 5 years out for NCA. Our 5 years out panel here in the Applied Division today is going to begin with the founding editors of the Journal of Applied Communication Research, discussing the historical development of applied communication, and then we're going to move to scholars from several different disciplines that are often represented in applied communication, talking about their respective areas, and finally concluding with some challenges in doing applied communication scholarship from a few more scholars. And so to start off with, the panelists that will be starting, Ken Cisna is going to be channeled by Bill Eady, is that correct? Because he's not able to join us. And and then also Mark Hickson will be presenting, and Bill Eady will be presenting across the three of them, sort of tag teaming on the history, themes, and contributions of applied communication. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here today. I don't think we can talk about 5 years out until we talk about the 95 years past, and we can't really figure out where we're going until we know where we've come from. And so Mark and I are going to do this tag team that was supposed to include Ken Cisna, but his wife had gallbladder surgery yesterday, so he wasn't able to be with us. So I'm going to do my part of our essay, and then Mark's going to do his part, and Ken's going to do, and I will come back and do Ken's part from notes that Larry printed out. Thank you, Larry. And this essay appears in, and I need to publicize this because it just came out, the Routledge Handbook of Applied Communication Research, which is available at your favorite local bookstore and also down in the exhibit area. This is chapter 1 of that, and the history of applied communication research is interesting. It comes out of this, what I will call the speech tradition in communication. There is also a journalism tradition in communication, and the journalism tradition doesn't think about applied research at all, because everything they do has an applied component to it, and that's just taken for granted. So in the speech tradition, we have both we have both theoretical research and applied research, and people have tried to make a distinction, but it's been very fuzzy and it's been very difficult to do that. So we have to go back to the founding of the speech discipline back in 1914 in order to try to understand this. The founding was a political founding. It was marked by a group of people walking out of an NCTE, National Council of Teachers of English, meeting, which is an organization that had only been found two years prior. It was meeting here in Chicago, and there was a debate that had been going on about whether this group of people was the appropriate group for speech teachers to be a part of. They were teaching primarily in English departments. Departments were just forming then. It had been, the organization of universities had been much looser. There'd usually been like a professor in an area. But now there were departments, and there was bureaucracy, and so people were competing about where they should be. And the speech people were thinking that they weren't going to be well respected within English. But that wasn't a universal opinion. They took a poll the year before, and about 50% said, yeah, we should go and do our own thing. And about 50% said, no, we should stay and interact with our colleagues in English. So there were a bunch of people who decided, well, we're going to go ahead and do our own thing anyway. And so they went off and did that. But it was all teachers, and it was all activity. And even though there was some effort at doing theory over the years, it was really based in the activity. They brought in the speech disorders folks, and those are the people who were basically doing the research and constructing the theory. And Charles Wolbert, who was one of the early scholars in the field, actually wrote a definition of the discipline in 1923. And it was based on performance and activity. It was based on oral reading and public speaking and debate and discussion. Was a part of it at that particular point. And that lasted for a long time. There was research that started to form, and during World War II, toward the end of World War II, you had the publication of Tonson and Baird's famous book on rhetorical criticism, and that was sort of the heyday of the scholarship in that area. And in fact, in 1948, there were a group of people who were concerned that this emerging social science movement within the field might get lost. So they asked for a meeting at the Speech Association of America, which was what the organization was called then, saying, we'd like to form a group of social scientists that will be separate but it'll affiliate with SAA. Well, that group turned out to be the National Society for the Study of Communication, which eventually became ICA, and they ended up forming their own organization. It was a very similar thing to what happened in 1914. But that group was not so interested in necessarily, they were interested in promoting social science research, but they were also interested in doing things that would have an impact. That were interested, that at least that were applied, and they brought in business people to the organization as well as scholars because they wanted to have that kind of dialogue that went on. That's how ICA founded. They eventually changed direction, and they've gone off in a whole different way. I want to, before I turn this over to Ken, to Mark, I want to come to one key event that happened in the field, and I've actually heard it referred to at this conference, and that was the 1968 New Orleans Conference. And the New Orleans Conference was where the social scientists took over in the discipline. It was the place where there were a group of people, including rhetoricians, who went to New Orleans and were talking about, now, how should we take into account this social science movement that had burgeoned? And one of the papers that was presented at that conference was by Gary Cronkite, who is not particularly associated with applied research. But Gary Cronkite did a paper on groups and called for research on groups that would help them get better, that would help society. There was a social good that was associated with that, and that theme was very strong in 1968, as you can imagine why, within NCA. In fact, there was a bit of a reaction. In 1969, Marie Hockmuth Nichols, who was the president of the association, gave her presidential address, and she titled it The Tyranny of Relevance. Now, if you read the address, Nichols was really being fairly mild and saying, let's not rush into this and let's be scholarly about this. Let's not just go off and do social relevance. But there were people who went to her address, including former presidents of the association, who went there specifically so that they could get up, turn their back on her, and walk out. So that sets the stage for the founding of the Journal of Applied Communications Research, and that's what Mark's going to talk about.
Mine is somewhat of a personal account. In 1968, I was working on a doctorate at Southern Illinois University, and the person who turned out to be my dissertation director, in fact, had done a team dissertation. He and one of his colleague doctoral students had decided to do a dissertation on urban tension. And there was urban tension in 1968, incidentally. So the first three chapters of their dissertations are exactly the same. And the rest of them are two different individuals they studied. One was a guy named Thomas Sutton, whom most of you probably have never heard of. And the other was a guy named Jesse Jackson. And so that was sort of the beginning of Southern Illinois' interest in social relevance, if you will. I noticed Bill talked about SAA, and I was thinking, SAA, yeah, I remember that. I was on the Legislative Council when we were talking about changing the name of the association. There was a guy named Frank Dance who really wanted speech to be in the name, so we changed it to the Speech Communication Association, and then later, of course, we changed it to the National Communication Association. Well, so after I finished my dissertation, and my dissertation, incidentally, was on an analysis of communication within an anti-poverty agency in Illinois. Again, the social relevance terminology comes up. So I was drafted into the military, and I was in Washington, D.C., and my first thought was, I finished my dissertation, got my degree, and 2 weeks later I was drafted into the Army. And my whole purpose of going to grad school was to avoid going into the Army. So it didn't work. In any case, my thinking was that I'm going to be 3 years behind where I should be in my academic career, so I have to do something. So I started sending out these supposed articles to various journals, and they were all turned down, of course, because they were socially relevant. At least that was my contention. I mean, it couldn't be that they were bad, right? So after 7 of these things, I decided, what can you do about this? And I'm sure some of you have gone through some of these thoughts before. I mean, the journals just are not taking what I'm writing, and I don't really know what to do. And I came up with just a really weird idea. I'll just start my own journal, and then I can publish whatever I want to.
I love it.
So I talked to some people in the Speech Association of America at the time about the idea, and they said, it won't work. You're not going to get any submissions because you're not really part of an association. You're just an individual doing this. And you won't get any submissions, and nobody's going to subscribe to it. Well, that was in 1973. We published the first 2 issues, and it was twice a year when we first started it. And it was $7 a year for 2 issues. And I say that because of all of the cost of things in today's world, and it's a lot easier to print things in today's world. 8 years later, there were 2 issues a year for $7 a year. 8 years later. But the concern that I had was that the discipline, for the most part, was not dealing with social issues. In fact, most of the things that I was reading were some analysis of a speech that Abraham Lincoln gave, or somebody else gave 100 years later, or maybe 50 years later. And I just didn't see the point of it. Now, I do want to point out that we've moved a long ways, because now we have the rhetoric of inanimate objects as opposed to dead people. But the main point that I want to make is that that we do need to move a little bit further. I mean, 73 was 36 years ago. 36 years ago, I read an article by Dr. Fry, whom I met about that time, 72 I think it was. The article is about why are we, Larry, don't let me mischaracterize this. How could our research be more relevant? Is that, okay. And one of the things that Larry talked about was the notion of we don't translate things very well into human English. And as a matter of fact, some of you have probably gotten these comments, I know that I have, when I've submitted things to journals, that, this is just too easy for people to understand and we can't publish this. which I, if it were a sociology journal, I would understand that, but this is a communication journal. So I went through that, and I think Larry's absolutely right about that particular point and some other points that he made. But I think the other thing that we need to think about is, what are we doing here? And for the most part, we're writing a bunch of gobbledygook for one another, hoping, maybe praying, that 8 people will read this thing. And that's not what the Journal of Applied Communications research was all about. It was not about developing theory. It was not about writing gobbledygook. It was about coming up with practical solutions to social problems. And as far as I'm concerned, that's what it should be today. In fact, the other journals should be that, but, we do have the rhetoric of food that we have to have those things. So I do want to say one thing that I think is very important about this. in order for us to be relevant, we're going to have to begin making moral decisions, like it or not. And the idea of not making a moral decision is an immoral decision. Thank you. Oh, I did want to say one other thing. I haven't stopped this, but I had to go in a different kind of direction because I don't know that much about food. So, so I have a new book out with a former colleague of mine in sociology called Deviance and Crime in Colleges and Universities. So this is about some of the immorality that takes place where we are. Thank you.
All right. Well, now I am Ken Cisna to wrap this up, and thank you, Larry, for printing out Ken's notes that he had actually sent. As applied communication developed, the idea developed. It developed it kind of parallel in SCA. We are now called SCA rather than SAA, and with the journal. The Applied Communication section was founded in SCA in 1976, and it was founded in a reorganization, a rethinking of how SCA should be organized. Essentially, the idea was to create divisions, which were the large, broad areas of research and scholarship in the field, commissions, which were smaller, more specialized areas, and then they needed some place for people to go based on where they worked, and so they had a unit for community college faculty, they had a unit for K-12 teachers, and Jane Work, who was married to Bill Work, the executive secretary, and was also a vice president of the National Association of Manufacturers, said, business people could really use what the folks in this field do, and you ought to have a section where business people can come and learn about communication research. So they started what was called the Applied Communication section, based on Jane's idea of bringing in folks from who are not academics. The section had a few people who were like that, who associated with it. They were mostly people who had PhDs in the field and had gone out to work in non-academic settings. But a lot of people who associated with it were also people who were interested in doing training. And they were college professors who wanted to do training on the side, and they wanted a place to come and talk about how to do training. And then there were a few people who, like Larry Browning, who thought that there was something there for applied scholarship that could be done in the field. So you had these competing interests. You had business people, you had trainers who were professors, and you had a few people who were interested in scholarship. Meanwhile, Mark got tired of running this journal off. You can read all about that, how he and Don Stacks ended up doing the journal in the article. And he sold the journal to the University of South Florida. Keith Jensen became the editor. Ken was the co-editor. Keith unfortunately died right before the proofs from the first issue. Actually, they were in his mailbox at school when he died, and so Ken took over and ran the journal into the 80s. The idea was getting enough submissions. That was the problem. So they collaborated with the Applied Communication section, which by this time had some fights about who should lead it, and Larry Browning had been the chair of it, and then I was the chair of it after that, and we both were interested in pushing scholarship. In fact, I'd published a research editorial in Spectra, responding to Don Ellis's famous editorial about how communication people were a sham because they were going out and trying to teach stuff that we didn't really have research evidence to back up. And my response said, well, applied communication is a kind of research. And it has its own characteristics. And that caught on, and it started to be reflected in what the section was doing. So what JACR did was to sponsor a thematic panel and have it be competitive. and people submitted on the theme for the convention. And then Ken worked with the papers, and if you've ever worked with Ken, you know he's very meticulous and works very, very hard on making sure that everything is as good as it can possibly be. And then they would publish the papers. And they'd have a thematic section, and then they'd publish the rest of what they got, the best of the rest of what they got, and they would manage to fill 2 issues of the journal a year. Ken stepped down, and the journal kind of went into chaos for a while. Various members of the University of South Florida faculty tried to do special issues, but it was clearly going under. However, Jim Chesbrough at SCA had gone on the staff, and he had been Publications Board chair before that, and he was interested in expanding SCA's journal program. So they decided to go ahead and buy the journal, and I was named the first SCA editor of the journal, and basically they wanted to do something different. There had always been competing visions for it. Some people wanted communication today. They wanted a popular magazine with articles written by really magazine authors, but based on scholarship. And other people wanted a scholarly journal. And so we tried to do kind of a little of each at the beginning of it. We had pictures. There were some people. Charlie Conrad sent me a picture of himself as a kid. It is in there. We had pull quotes. It made it look more like a magazine. We had color. We had some things we had commentaries. We had pieces called applications, which were reviews of literature talking about how it could be applied. So it was a different kind of format that we tried at the beginning, and it was good, but it didn't really work. It was too expensive. So, and in fact, I ran out of pages a year early. So the pub board granted me an extra year's worth of pages and said, but no, we're going to make a mid editor format change. And so the last year of my issues was all looking like a journal like the rest of the NCA journals, and that's what it's been ever since. So as it transitioned, we ended up getting a journal that really became something that was focused on applied communication research, which is probably where we needed to be all along. The division, the section became a division in 1996. The training and development people went their own way and became a training and development division and to do their own thing. So we finally got totally focused on scholarship. And in 1997, SCA changed its name to NCA and removed the last vestiges of the speech tradition, although the speech tradition certainly is valued and remains with us up until now. But I'll let some of the other folks talk about the more recent history and where we ought to be going. Thank you.
Up first, we have Dr. Lynne Webb from the University of Arkansas to talk about the future of applied relational communication research.
Thanks, Erica. I'm so glad to go after Bill. I was chair of the applied section when we converted to being a division, so I'm proud to say I'm the only person in NCA who's been chair of both the applied section and applied division, and helped shepherd us through those political changes. It was fun and interesting challenge. My assignment today is to talk to you about, perhaps, my humble opinion, the most socially relevant research done in the discipline, which is we do research, myself and colleagues, do research on how adults communicate as they enact voluntary relationships. In other words, how they socialize, how they're social. And I suspect that virtually everyone would think that their social network is very relevant to their lives and to the reality in which they live and co-construct with others. So I believe that the research that I do and colleagues like me is incredibly socially relevant and incredibly applied. One of the great challenges for me in thinking about this talk, when Erica was kind enough to have me as one of the panelists, was to try to even think of how do I distinguish applied relational communication from regular relational communication, whatever that is. I think the tradition in my sub-area is to be applied. I don't know. I mean, I could point to a few things that very early on were published that are more sort of, I don't know what you'd say, pure research or something, but one of the hallmarks of interpersonal communication or relational communication is that in the abstract of the article, the research is always contextualized. And I'm going to talk to you about 4 changes I've seen across my lifetime as a scholar. And the first one is the notion that all topics are contextualized, which of course makes them very applied, because the research is only relevant to this particular applied context. And research in relational comm is contextualized 3 ways. It's contextualized by the relationship. The people we're studying, are they interacting in a dating relationship, a marital relationship? Is it parent-child interactions? Is it family generally? Is it collegial? Is it in the workplace? Like what is the relational context? The second way it's contextualized is literally the type of interaction. Is this an initial interaction? Is this an acquaintance interaction? Is this an intimate interaction? Is this an ongoing long-term relationship? So we contextualize that second way, and then the third way is literally we're often studying the characteristics of the interactants per se. So are we talking about, for example, how women initially establish friendships in the workplace? So see how there's 4 layers immediately of contextualization. Now, how can you say research like that is not applied? Because it only applies, whatever you find, really only applies in that specific way. So I'm really hard-pressed when I look at my journals that I read and the work that I read in Applied Comm, and I would love to tell all the editors I've read every article in the journal, and I've read quite a few, but really I'm more interested in the ones in my area, and I've read pretty much all of those, and it's right away, of course, it's applied, but it's also applied with its and comm monographs. Okay, the second change, in addition to contextualizing topics, the second change I've seen is in collaborations. One would think if you did interpersonal research, you really wouldn't need to collaborate with anybody. You could just kind of interview people about how their friendships work or survey people about how their marriages work. In reality, the work, in my 35 years as a scholar, I have seen the work become increasingly done in collaborative research teams. In part because we're using increasingly complex methodological models of how to do that research. And the research, like it's a 3-stage research, and it takes sometimes 30 people to get the job done. So I know every semester I have at least one research team going, and the other day someone asked me when I started that, and I had to really think back. And I think I had started that about 5 years into my career, and it was the first time that I noticed that virtually everything being published in monographs was at least a 2-phase study. I mean, if you're talking about, in other words, you can't publish every study you do. You just do the first one, kind of see what you get, and modify, do the second, and the third. I'm on a 4th-stage study right now, and, I'd be embarrassed to tell you how many research teams it took to get to that one. I'm embarrassed, but it takes a lot of people to get to that point. So that's the first thing I see, is increasing size of the collaborative teams to produce the scholarship. I think the second trend I'm seeing is how interdisciplinary the work is. Now, my area, I'll be honest with you, we grew out of, so to speak, our intellectual forefathers and foremothers really often were in psychology and sociology. Some of the initial theory that was tested was borrowed from those disciplines. So we're kind of an interdisciplinary offspring to some extent. However, I'd say starting about 15 years ago, the theory and the research was strong enough that we didn't need to do that anymore. But we do. We often do interdisciplinary teams. We often pair with practitioners to study what we study, and I suspect that's going to be a trend across all of these areas. But I want to say we do that. Now, I think part of what's driving that is the grant money. I think the granting agency's preference for interdisciplinary applications and pairings with practitioners is somewhat driving that. But I also think that the complete advantage is driving it. There's a lot of advantages to having multiple perspectives. Okay, third, I'm getting science, like move on. Okay, very quickly. I think theory has developed enormously in the 35 years I've watched us work. We began in my area in relational comm with borrowed theory, as I mentioned earlier. Now we have quite a bit of native theory to our discipline. Both the native theory and the borrowed theory now has been modified, refined, based on communication scholarship. I was at Leslie Baxter's lecture yesterday on relational dialectics, and I sat there in awe thinking about, I was privileged to go to graduate school with Leslie, and I'll say that she was talking about that way back. And the way we think about it now as a discipline is completely different because of all the scholarship that has modified our thinking and expanded it. Okay. And last but not least, I think our research methods have changed. I have seen an enormous change, and I think, again, others will echo this, not just in relational comm, but across the discipline, a real movement from doing empirical, variable, analytical research, although we still do some of that, to a real emphasis on qualitative work and grounded theory emerging from large data sets that take a very intensive analysis to understand. And I think we're better for it. I also think we're much better at triangulating data and looking at studies from multiple methodological perspectives. I like to tell my students there's many paths to truth. I've been on all of them. It's been an incredible journey. Thank you very much. Colleagues, next.
Our next presenter is Dr. Dave Siebold from the University of California, Santa Barbara, to talk to us about the future of applied organizational communication. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you. Thank you, Erica, and the panelists and our respondents and all of you here this early in the morning. I would like to talk about the future of applied communication through the lens of organizational communication, and I'd like to do it in two ways. First, to talk about what I think is likely to happen, and secondly, to talk about what I think should happen, because I don't think it's likely to on its own. And with regard to likelihood, I'd like to draw off of an argument that the sociologist James Coleman made in the 1980s, in which he argued that the rise of prominent schools of social research, the Chicago School, for example, until the 1940s, the Columbia School between 40s and 60s, were really a response to societal changes in which scholars were immersed. And I think taking that same line of argument, one might suspect that a lot of the research that applied communication researchers will do in the organizational communication area will be a response to the kind of problems that we confront both as members of the academy and also, of course, as members of the citizenry. So when one looks at issues of economic scarcity, when one looks at issues of globalization, the ability of small groups of members who form an organization to surpass barriers to entry into markets and commerce, the aging of the workforce, made more so now by the need to stay in the workforce for an older group that's now lost many of their retirement, and yet the influx of the millennial generation, we're going to find a much more intergenerational mix. I think the amount and nature of the defense spending that we are doing and are likely to continue to do, the breakdown of interdisciplinary barriers, largely grant-related, but not only, and I think particularly as communication scholars have come to find their place on multidisciplinary grant teams. I think the emergence of powerful new computing technologies that enable sophisticated research, let alone the appropriation of technologies in the workforce that create new organizational forms, all of those forces and many more that I'm sure you're thinking of will likely lead to slight differences in research. We'll see, I think, in the applied organizational area, much more emphasis on multicultural collaboration and issues of diversity that are beyond simple ideological diversity. I think we're going to find a focus on team and organizational performance that really ties to survival. And so when you see work like Peter Mongi's work on population ecology and what organizations make it and what don't, I think those kinds of outcomes are going to become much more important. I think, of course, the transformative effects of how organizations incorporate and utilize new technologies. Beyond that, the intergenerational mix that's going to be, I think, of increasing importance to communication scholars. I think we're going to be doing more studies that fall between the small and the large. We've had this uneasy bifurcation of small group research and organization studies. I think there are areas of 20 to 75 people where we're talking about emergency response providers, traders in the pit, construction sites, you name it. I think that's an area that has just fallen between the cracks. And because we're going to have, I think, more powerful simulation techniques that will enable us to get at that, let alone the ability to do much more multi-member, multi-sited, multidisciplinary, qualitative and quantitative, that is mixed methods research. So I think we're going to see more of that in the future, and I certainly hope we do. Those are things that and I could go on that front. And in fact, in the Handbook chapter that I've collaborated on, there are several other areas of research where we suspect there's likely to be continued thrust, and I'm not alluding to those at all. Beyond that, I think that there are traditional areas of research that are likely to be rebranded. Take issues of employee voice, for example. I think while we will continue, as we should, to have a focus on issues of gender and voice, gender and race as regards voice, I think there'll be a more of a larger emphasis on class. For example, as a proxy for class unions. Union survival is something that concerns me deeply. 1983, we had 1 out of every 4 Americans have represented by bargaining agents. 2005, 1 out of every 8. Go to areas like the employee relationship with the organization. We've had a continuing focus on salary inequities, executive salaries, ESOPs, and the like. I think now what we're likely to find is a lot more concern with the indirect benefits, medical, for example, and retirement, because those will become much more salient in the employment relationship. Issues, for example, of the cafeteria approach to medical benefits that we're so used to. 1987, there was roughly 37% of organizations that offered that. 2003, 87%, and I suspect it's going up. And so as a result, what I think we are likely to find is some of the traditional communication approaches, uncertainty reduction, information search, which will be applied to these kinds of areas. I think it's a truism that we've moved from manufacturing to service to a knowledge economy, but on the other hand, we seem to have abrogated our responsibility, I think, and our interest, what should be an interest, in looking at manufacturing organizations. There are 100,000 of them in this country alone that employ 20 people or more, and that just has now become a vacuum as so many OrgComm researchers have moved to the public sector. We've lost that. Final remarks. I think that a few things that I suspect, that I hope will happen, that I think needs to happen. I think we need to have the received view of applied communication challenged. We have become so ethnocentric about our struggle within the discipline that I think there are 2 problems here. One is if we take a starting point of any of the popular definitions of applied communication research and then look at whether or not that's been going on for the last 40 years, I think it's indubitable that it has. It just has not been going on within the structures that we call applied communication research. Secondly, I think we've become so ethnocentric in our research that as a result we've lost that whole kind of focus on globalization, and we don't see that in our journals in this discipline, or at least in this association. This is an old Siebold saw, but I'll just kind of push it again because I have talked about this in some of my earlier work. I think some of our best work in our discipline as a whole that also has the most applied character has been the major grant-funded research, that kind of multi-sided, theory-relevant, socially applied and, in fact, problem or solution-oriented, often policy-driven, has not appeared in our journals. Take the Applied Communication Handbook that we've got here, a marvelous piece of work. I was on the editorial board. I encouraged the editors to have the exemplar pieces. At the end of that, there are 4 really wonderful, wonderful pieces by strongest scholars, I think, in our discipline. And yet, if you do a citation, a bibliometric citation count, they cite themselves, as they should, 66 times, because it's all about their research programs. Only 2 of those 66 articles ever appeared in JACR, and those date back to 97 and 95. We are just not getting the people who are doing that kind of strong research, putting it in our structures. I have also perpetuated that kind of belief. When I created an encyclopedia entry, I looked at the structures that existed at all of the communication associations around the world. Not finding any that were like our own, I falsely concluded that we weren't doing applied communication there. And yet now that I'm working on a book for a Spanish press, I'm actually looking at research that by any of our standards we would call applied communication research. So I think we need to kind of broaden our view and look a little differently at what we do. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Our next presenter is Dr. Lisa Sparks from Chapman University, and we'll just do a little technology switch and be ready to go.
Okay. There you have it. It works. Whoops. All right. Well, it's such an honor to be here this morning, early in the morning. Thank you for having me. I'm taking a slightly different approach, and I hope you'll find it a bit interesting rather than sort of doing the, as you call the saw, right, of what you say over and over and over again. I'm still saying some of those things, but making hopefully some interesting connections, a different way of reflecting on what we do in terms of applied research from a health communication lens. I'm calling it a conversation across space and time. Now, in terms of the history of applied research, it's such an honor, again, to provide a health communication lens with this important title, Applied Communication 5 Years Out. When invited to this, a few non-obvious things sort of came to mind. I thought I could repeat the same sort of concepts and approaches as I've said many times across many panels, conferences, countries, and so forth. But I thought of a couple of things. First, in a very important essay by one of the great American intellectuals of the last century, Alfred North Whitehead, written originally back in 1912, almost 100 years ago. And I'll begin my remarks by quoting some lines from a book he wrote, whose first chapter is, in fact, in this essay. One main idea runs through the various chapters of this book. The students are alive, and the purpose of education is to stimulate and guide their self-development. It follows, as a corollary from this premise, that the teachers also should be alive with living thoughts. So, now let me make some connections here of how this works for what I'm talking about. These words speak to the essence of what we should be striving for in terms of the application of health communication in the 21st century. No pun. From one of my books. Now I would like to explore with you my interpretation of this notion of living thoughts and see how liberal arts application via translation of theory and research into practice, which is the core of what we strive to do and how they embody this notion. So again, I offer the title of Applied Communication Research from a Health Communication Lens, a conversation across space and time. I'm going to explain that and show how that actually connects with the living thoughts, which I think is one of our biggest challenges. I'll begin by illustrating this point through a painting that I hope will offer some interesting reflection about where we come from, who we are, and what we're trying to achieve as applied communication scholars. I once heard a presentation about the liberal arts, and the speaker used the School of Athens as a framework, and it reminded me that I could apply it to this context in hopefully an interesting way. This is a very famous and beautiful painting of Raphael, who painted it, it's in the Sistine Chapel. So now you have to go to the Sistine Chapel and look at the characters as I explain them, and you'll discover things on your own as well. Of course, in the Vatican Museum, amongst the many astonishing rooms of the Vatican palaces, this is one that really struck me. As you go through the crowd, you go through the Stanza della Signatura. On one of the walls, you're going to see this fresco, La Scuola di Atene, or the School of Athens. And it represents connections to the interdisciplinary, the global approaches, and the translation of research into practice is the way that I'm interpreting it here. Now, on one hand, each of these figures that you see represent an important philosopher, a scientist, mathematician from the ancient world. On the other hand, many of the actual faces of the figures are famous people from Raphael's own time, including a self-portrait of Raphael himself in the lower right corner of the painting. In the center, you see Plato in a red robe with blue. Okay, he's pointing to the heavens, carrying a book under his arm. It's one of the most debated and analyzed books that he ever wrote, the Timaeus. It's where he discusses the origin of the universe and the influence of music on the creation of the universe. And if you look more closely, you can see that Raphael, in fact, has represented Plato with the face of Leonardo da Vinci. It's pretty interesting, right? And you see To his left, which is to our right, we see Aristotle also holding a book, The Ethics. It's almost as if Raphael wanted to make sure that we understood the nature of learning is not just about physics, mathematics, and so forth, but about encompassing ethical values and so forth. So Pythagoras is also pictured in the bottom left, and there are other characters peppered throughout the scene here. To the right of Plato, our left, you're going to find a man dressed in a green robe standing next to a much younger man. This is Alexander, he himself a student of Aristotle. The older man, Socrates, who was Plato's teacher. Voila. So these four figures represent 4 generations of thinkers. Also reference to the intergenerational that you were talking about, which is what we're continuing to see. So what Raphael is doing here is he's bringing them together because what matters is the conversations that are linking them, right? Philosophy and knowledge are shared and transmitted across different generations, and we see that. And so that's why I thought this would be kind of interesting to show. Now just sort of keep that in mind, and I'll, as I give the rest of my talk, and I hope that you'll have a chance, make an excuse to go to the Vatican again and look at this from a different viewpoint. So why the School of Athens to illustrate connections to applied health communication? What's going on here? What is she doing? Well, first of all, in terms of applied health communication priorities, we must get out of the confines of our own discipline. We must get out there and cross-collaborate, set the conditions for learning, and educate scholars from other disciplines. That's our job. We need to get out there in our communities, in other disciplines and fields, and so forth. Applied context should be taking the lead and setting the priorities for the 21st century. We should be doing so in the field as well. We should be joining and creating collaborative, interdisciplinary research teams across disciplines, colleges, universities, communities, for NIH and related grants, all these interdisciplinary grants and all the calls that are out there, which I do think drive some of the interdisciplinary approaches these days. But it brings about stronger, better research, and we translate that into practice. We bring expertise, for example, on health communication relationships and messages, and we link the expertise of scholars to complementary fields. We should be linking theory courses, emphasizing health communication principles, and link it to biostatistics programs, right? Link it to theory courses, to regression courses. Oh, gosh, I have 1 minute left. We should staff our innovative programs with scholars from complementary fields, not just drawing from our fields. We should build programs with these linkages in mind, which is what I've been trying to do. It builds better science for students, better conditions for learning about others' areas of expertise, better and stronger conditions for funding our work. Wrapping up with my last couple of thoughts here. The second major thought is a notion of, globalization has become sort of the mot du jour, or the word of the day. And indeed, it's where we should be heading in terms of application of health communication. It's worth paying attention to another important character in the figure, Pythagoras. Behind Pythagoras, you see Averroes, who was an Arab, and Averroes was a very influential religious philosopher and talked about reason of matters in faith and so forth, and brought those ideas to the Western world. And so a lot of what we know of Greek thought is because of that interdisciplinary work, that sort of global, those global conversations of the work of Averroes and other great Arab commentators of Aristotle and his work. So we sort of see, hopefully, how that conversation translates the interdisciplinary and the global perspectives. And my last thought here is the notion of translating research, our theory and methods, into practice or application. And how do we do that? We do that through the search for universal unifying principles, which is, in fact, also what that painting, I think, depicts. So, in sum, where do we go from here? We take interdisciplinary, global, applied approaches. We need to test health communication messages to stimulate desired health behaviors from a variety of theoretical perspectives to very targeted, underserved populations. We need to embed health risk communication areas into areas of prevention, detection, family decision-making, medical adherence, breaking bad news, survivorship, health disparities, and pay attention to these RFPs, requests for proposals, and call for papers that relate to health literacy, health communication, and campaigns to targeted underserved populations from these very interdisciplinary global perspectives. We need personalized medicine from cell to patient with an approach tailored to each individual case and patient needs, tailored messaging, again, from various approaches. Research indicates that physicians who pay attention to aspects of health literacy tend to be better in terms of communicating with patients, which tends to increase patient satisfaction, which, of course, reduces, litigation. So patient satisfaction is known to be one of the biggest predictors of medical malpractice. Translating research into practice is up to us. We need to take it to the streets. We need to get out there. Our strategies for saturation must complement these various evidence-based approaches, from personalized medicine to tailored messaging to product placement. Finally, messages must be available, accessible, and entertaining even, for people to be more likely to engage in the recommended behavior. Messages need to parallel with availability and sound medical science, and that's what we need to be doing with applied health communication. It's up to us to continue the dialogue and discourse with the ultimate health of the public in mind. Our work can change lives in dramatic ways, from the biological medical side to the complementary social and behavioral side, and that's what we need to be doing in terms of increasing the quality of health communication, improving, and knowledge of effective practices will increase if we put these things to practice and keep these things in mind. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Now Dr. Ann Darling from the University of Utah will speak about the future of applied instructional communication.
Well, I want to begin by, on record, thanking Dawn Braithwaite for putting together these panels. It's going to be a nice, rich resource for generations that follow us and for the actual celebration of the 100th year anniversary, and I feel very honored to be on this panel, so I want to thank Erica for composing this panel and for inviting me. I feel very complimented. And I also want to thank Larry and Ken for this fabulous book that they've edited. As I've told Larry numerous times privately, and now I will confess publicly, I'm never quite as good a writer as I am when Larry Fry is editing me, so I'm very grateful for that. I want to spend my time talking about primarily three things that I hope we get to business on in the next 5 years and longer, and I want to do that by starting with 2 points that of what we know, knowledge of what we know, that are covered in the handbook, in our chapter of the handbook. The first thing I want to talk about is if I was forced to say what instructional research has been doing in a programmatic way, in an applied way, I would have to say that the research on service learning is both programmatic and robust, and there's lots of it. So we know a lot about communication instruction in service learning environments. We know that students report stronger personal connections to the curriculum. We know that they report increased confidence and deeper understanding in the subject matter of communication. And we know that we increase students' social awareness and willingness to become critically or civically involved. We know that. There's a lot of research that helps us assert those claims. But from there, where I'd like us to go is we need more rigorous and specific research on communication learning outcomes in service learning pedagogies. I'm going to join Tim Sell now and hail another handbook, the Handbook of Research on Communication Instruction that Deanna Fassett and John Warren have just edited, and it'll be available in March. And Tim has a chapter in that book in which he asserts the same thing, which is when we do service learning and we assess the outcomes of service learning, we're assessing the most general outcomes of learning. Do they like it? Were they willing to do it again? Did they learn as much in the service learning course as they would have learned in the classroom context? But it seems to me, in borrowing from learning theory in the field of education, we would expect very different learning outcomes in an engaged pedagogical situation. We would expect deeper learning and probably different learning. And I'd like to see us explore those learning outcomes. For example, I would imagine that students that were engaged in a service learning practice with real partners and real consequences for their actions, I would expect them to be fairly adept at audience adaptation. I would think that they would have a more complex understanding of flexible message structures. I would expect them to be better negotiators. I would expect them to be better listeners. And I would expect them to come out of that experience more collaborative and understanding how to collaborate in a variety of environments. But we really don't know that. We don't know whether people in service learning environments actually learn collaboration differently than if they were taking a small group communication class at the University of Utah. We don't know that. We don't know if students involved in service learning learn better message construction practices, and by better I mean they've got a variety of ways to construct a message depending on what audience and what function they're trying to accomplish. We don't know if they learn that better in a service learning environment than in a traditional classroom, and I think we should be able to know that, and I think the theories in education would say, of course, if you engage them in a real educational environment, a real applied environment, they're going to learn more. I think that we can go to the communication across the curriculum literature who has learned, because they have to, how to assess the communication learning that's embedded in different environments. People who have been doing communication instruction in engineering environments have to assess the particular, specific, and unique learning outcomes, communication learning outcomes, that engineers acquire in their instruction. And so all the CXC literature would be very useful for us. So that's one large category of research that I'd like to see more of. The second two fall into a completely different category, and before I move into this, I want to call your attention to some things that you may or may not be paying attention to. I know that Mark is, from the title of his book, Deviance and Crime in Colleges and Universities. In suburban educational environments, the high school dropout rate is 50%, in others it's 70%, people dropping out of high school. It takes under-resourced and historically underrepresented students much longer to complete a bachelor's degree, if they complete it at all. And so I want to kind of put those fairly uncomfortable facts on the table to tell you that we know a lot about how to change that. In communication, applied communication education research, we know that communities provide support for educational attainment and success through communication practices. And so we know a lot about how to help people support each other in attaining educational success. And so I want to say to you that my name is Ann Darling, and I'm here to recruit you. We need to use what we know about community engagement and collaboration to help people help other people go to school. And we need to use what we know about support to help people be successful in school. And so in the next 5 years, I hope we see more rigorous and programmatic research that applies our tools of collaboration to help turn some of these things around so that more kids are going to school and successful in school. Their parents know how to support them. Their parents know how to participate in the educational setting. And that then brings my final point. I think I have about a minute. If you're going to go into those sorts of environments and bring our tools of communication, I think we are morally obliged to bring our critical lens to the scene and make sure that when we're teaching communication and collaboration, we're not reasserting practices of oppression and supremacy. So we need to understand real collaboration that results in real multicultural success and environments in which we're learning as much as we're teaching about how to make education a truly deliberative and democratic practice for everyone. And so I'm very glad to be a part of this panel, and I'm not lying. I'm here to recruit you. Please help us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Anne. What an inspirational way to end our presentations on the applied communication context. How we're going to finish in terms of presentations from the stage is to have Dr. Larry Fry from the University of Colorado and Dr. Laura Stafford from the University of Kentucky give some responses to what they've heard and remarks that they brought with them about the future of applied communication in terms of some challenges that they see from two specific vantage points. Laura, as you know, is the current editor of the Journal of Applied Communication Research, so she has a big view of the field to be speaking from, as well as her own experiences. And as you've already been told throughout this, Larry and Ken Cisna just recently wrapped up the Handbook of Applied Communication Research. So they were still not sure who was going first, so whoever stands up. Laura's coming on up. Welcome, Laura.
I want to keep my remarks incredibly brief in light of the limited time that we have and speak from a very narrow perspective, that of in the current role of the editor of Journal of Applied Communication Research. And I think in many ways some of the challenges that the journal faces are some of the same challenges that were present when it was founded. And through the birth of the journal and all those growing pains. Well, I think we're still not very mature. We're maybe stuck in adolescence somewhere, because I still think we're not quite sure as a field what applied means. Almost everything, I would have to agree with almost everything that all the speakers said, and I won't tell you those little pieces that I don't agree with. So I have to agree with almost everything. We are relevant across so many contexts. We are relevant in so many areas. Vaguely going way back to Watzlawick, Bavin, and Jackson, we cannot not communicate. So if we cannot not communicate, then what's not relevant for us to study? And so we have this tension between this diverse, once you're everything, you almost become nothing. So this identity, which we've heard over and over, we are talking about SAWS, what is our identity as a field? And we don't have a kind of any type of professional recognized label, communicologist or something that lay people can grab onto. People might say, oh, well, we need an MD in on this project, and we need a sociologist or a psychologist in on this project, and we need somebody who studies communication on this project. So part of it is in language, but let me go back directly to the journal here. I think that makes it hard in some ways, at least for me, as an editor, to know, well, what is the role of this journal? What is the purpose of this journal? Given that almost everything could be applied from broad, from string theory in theory could be applied, I assume some way, to people who write these very small, by small I mean narrow, translational pieces. In this one context, this is what people need to do, and I'm not saying that it can be incredibly helpful to know, for one mother to know, this is what I need to do to this one child screaming right now. But I get this incredible variety of manuscripts where I have to write back and say things such as, where's the application here, because the people aren't making the link, and then I get an obligatory, oh, here's the practical implications section, and leave it to somebody else to do, to very specific best practices that are clearly, immediately applied. And I'm not sure I know where in between there, what the role of the journal is in terms of making that translation. Who is our readership? Are we writing for each other so that other scholars can make the translation and take the findings in that journal and apply them? Or are we trying to reach a broader audience where we've said, okay, here's our research, and we're translating it for you, whoever you might be? So my struggle is still continually figuring out where the journal is and where it should be going and what we want it to do 5 years from now. And maybe we'll still be having the same conversation. In some ways, I hope so, maybe. Anyway, thank you, and I'll turn the floor over to Larry.
Great. Well, in a chapter that Sunwolf and I wrote in the Routledge Handbook of Applied Communication that Ken and I edited, we noted a number of challenges, or what we call applied divides, that have confronted applied communication scholars over the years. And this really complements the chapter that was written by Bill and by Ken and Mark Hickson, who was one of my first professors, actually, in undergraduate, so I owe him a lot on that. We talked about some of those divides that we've already sort of crossed. For example, differentiating applied communication research from applied communication and from organizational communication consulting. Those were often inflated in the early years. We talked about linking theory and application. Well, remember that sort of debate that took place, and of course the debate about the methodological procedures for conducting applied communication research, the sort of quantitative-qualitative debate at one point, the field laboratory debate, sort of trying to link rigor and relevance together. Those challenges, I think, primarily were directed at applied communication research by what we might call non-applied communication scholars. I mean, after all, who can forget Don Ellis's 1982 essay in Spectra that talked about applied communication? Actually, he was really talking about programs in organizational communication, public relations, and advertising, which were then associated with applied communication. And he said that field was, quote, narrow, theoretically vacuous, without a research base, and, just as an aside, morally degenerate and politically naive. Fortunately, those challenges, I think, were confronted and they were conquered. In fact, in 1991, less than 10 years after Ellis wrote that essay, he claimed in an article that was published in Edie's special issue of the Journal of Applied Communication Research on setting the agenda for such scholarship that, quote, applied research is crucial to the professional and intellectual development of communication. Ellis now studies dialogue groups that are comprised of Israeli Jews and Palestinians and looks at reconciliation there. Today, I think, however, the challenges that confront applied communication researchers come from within the domain of research rather than from outside. I've been arguing for a while now, and most recently articulated in that chapter in the Handbook, as well as in an essay published in the Journal of Applied Communication Research that was part of a special joint forum by that journal and Communication Monographs on whether communication research has made a difference. And by the way, they're looking for responses right now. I think the deadline's December 15th for those, December 1st. That one major challenge, and I would say the major challenge confronting applied communication research, is the need to move from observation to intervention. Most applied communication research constitutes observational research in which researchers stand outside the stream of human events and they describe, they interpret, they explain, they perhaps critique, and then they typically conclude by offering recommendations for others, practitioners or the people studied who are supposed to enact these recommendations. And in fact, now a section is required for that in the Journal of Applied Communication Research. These observational studies are what Kevin Carnegie from Suffolk University and I, in our work on communication activism, have called third-person perspective studies. And that, the observational approach, is in some measure, I think, derived from the traditional privileging, even in applied communication research, of theory over application. Go take a look at the editorial policy for Journal of Applied Communication Research. You will see the word theory mentioned about, I think, 7 or 8 times in that statement, and applied not very often. And by the way, in response to sort of Lisa, out of the Greek thoughts, go back to the Greek origins of the word theory, from theoria and a number of other words. You know what it means? It means being a spectator who looks at and contemplates the world without trying to affect it. And that kind of observational applied communication research stands in contrast to first-person perspective applied communication studies, in which researchers use their resources, their theories, their methods, their pedagogies, their other practices to intervene into discourses, typically to promote social change, although in some cases to maintain what works. Now, although intervention-oriented applied communication scholarship is increasing, in part because of the amount of grant funding that we heard about that's now available, and as the health commies, the communication scholars, have well discovered, as well as because of the general call for a more engaged scholarship. But it's still minuscule compared to observational applied communication research. Just take a look at any issue of the Journal of Applied Communication Research and you'll see that. One reason that intervention-oriented communication research lags behind observational applied communication research is because intervention typically is not taught in graduate communication programs. Look, students receive a lot of training in theory and methods, and they can always use more. But how many graduate programs teach students how to intervene into discourses? Of course, it's hard to teach something that someone does not do or does not privilege. Most graduate schools are pretty much bastions for maintaining the status quo, not for challenging society. So a central challenge, I think, is the need for applied communication researchers, especially new researchers, to learn how to intervene into discourses and document that intervention process. One reason for promoting intervention-oriented applied communication scholarship, as I argue in that special form, is because if researchers want to make a difference, which I assume, by the way, is the case for all scholars, but especially for applied communication scholars, then why not make a difference through research rather than relying on someone else to make a difference from research by hoping that someone else will somehow pick up on it? Now, although applied communication scholars certainly need to learn how to make a difference from research they and others conduct by engaging in more translational scholarship that takes the knowledge that's discovered through applied communication research and interprets it through the lens of the public and other types of organizations, groups, societies. I require an op-ed assignment, for example, in my applied communication course. We don't teach that kind of translational scholarship, but there's a greater need, I think, to learn how to intervene into discourses. In fact, if applied communication researchers were more proficient in intervening and studying those interventions, they could study their translational practices as interventions, documenting how those translational research practices can make a difference. Dave mentioned the notion of studying voice. I guess I would say, where is our voice as applied communication researchers? So one final challenge is that there are different types of intervention-oriented applied research. One can intervene, for instance, to promote more disparities between the rich and the poor, versus trying to promote social justice. This is the point that Anne was really talking about intervening to try to change the conditions that are affecting, the systemic conditions that are affecting under-resourced groups and preventing social justice from occurring. And so I've been an advocate for social justice interventions, which is the goal of the communication activism approach to scholarship that Carnegie and I have tried to articulate. That approach will not be sustained without the kind of pedagogical work that Anne is talking about. Right now, David Palmer and I are working on a book called Communication Activism Pedagogy about taking that to our classrooms and way beyond our classrooms. So an important challenge, I think, is for applied communication research to learn how to intervene into discourses to promote social justice. Look, applied communication research has come a long way in the last few decades. There undoubtedly are many challenges yet remaining. The biggest challenge, I believe, in the next 5 years and beyond is whether we can successfully cross the divide from descriptive spectators to activist interveners who engage in direct, vigorous action to promote a more socially just world. Thank you.
Well, my thanks to everyone across 9 people who you have seen speak up here. We still do have time for probably one question or comment from the audience. If there is anyone who feels compelled, the microphones up here do work. If you have questions for the panelists, or Laura or Larry can come up here if one of the questions is for them. Yes, please.
I'll try to make it one question rather than 3. It seems to me that at least 3 of the panelists, and maybe even Larry, implied that we are ready to move from the term applied communication research to something else. And my question is, well, some implied that there is no need for an applied journal because it should be integrated into all the other journals. That's what my impression is. And also that are we talking now about translational training and development and activism as interchangeable words with applied? Anyone who wants to address that?
I think it's very complex. I think applied communication is one of those terms like patriotism. It means one thing to me and something else to a colleague. I think so. I think it's broad enough to actually encompass everything you said. And I've been an activist for applied research since I was a graduate student. And yeah, I wish monographs would publish applied pieces. I think they should, and they do occasionally. And I think they should more. I loved what Laura said. I think that she's getting pieces from folks who don't know where to send things, as every journal editor does. And I think she's, doing a great job educating people about that by the way she responds. But I would not, I'm probably the one that you think said we shouldn't have applied research or something. We absolutely should have applied research. I'm a strong advocate for applied research. I don't have a problem with it. But I think, training and development to me is, I've seen research on training and development. I've published research on training and development. But I think the praxis is different than research. Hopefully they're wedded, hopefully you don't engage in a training program without assessing whether it's effective and then modify it so it can be more effective. So I think they can facilitate the success of each other. Is training development part of applied communication research? I think it can be. I think there are people who go out there and do training development without being cognizant of whether the techniques they're using or even the content they're teaching is what they should be doing. They aren't, informing themselves about the existing research and expanding the research on that area. And I would say to them, you're not doing what you need to do either. I think we should all do it all, I guess is what I'm saying. Or try to do what's best. Like if you're going to be a trainer, you need to be careful that what you're training, being as effective a trainer as you can, and it's research that will inform that as well as theory. But I think applied research can be anything we study in comm, we can study in an applied way. Maybe not the rhetoric of food, but most things. You can deconstruct the food channel. That can be very applied. So
it looks like Larry and Dave also want to reply.
Yes, just a quick response. I mean, it depends a little bit how you define applied. If you look in the dictionary, it's put in practice. I would agree with you that runs rampant throughout all of our journals, and so that's a difficult issue. I have argued elsewhere that I wouldn't mind restricting applied. That's my own bias to when researchers intervene to make a difference. So I think that would really carve out a particular type of space. Now, does that mean that things like training and development, translational practices, and social justice are the same thing? No, they're very, very different kinds of animals in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. They might all fall under the same umbrella of a researcher, him or herself, intervening in discourses to try to accomplish something. But there's a big difference between training people in IBM to sort of make more money and trying to do some educational practices where we try to solve the kinds of problems that Aaron was talking about in terms of under-resourced individuals not graduating high school. These are not the same things, but they all would fall under that general umbrella about the definition that I would use for applied. That's not, nobody else agrees on that.
And Dave.
A two-part answer. One goes to the issue of applied, the other goes to the issue of research. I think I would not have any problem if we worked ourselves out of a job. That is, if we basically lost applied and acknowledged that there is that type of research going on across the discipline and didn't get hung up on what our space is in that. To me, the more substantive issue, and this may be representative of the division in the discipline, is the issue of research. I think that there are lots of types of research that we do that don't necessarily qualify as scholarship. To my mind, if we're going to preserve an area of applied communication, it needs to be scholarship. In the organizational communication area, there are firms, whether it's Wyatt, whether it's Towers Perrin, that are doing far better research than we are, with far more resources that are very need-based, very solution-oriented. They may not necessarily be the kinds of clients that some of us might favor, but they're not in any way scholarship. To my mind, that's where theory comes back in. If our purpose, and that's why I have no problem whatsoever with the guise of the journal as it is now stated, nor do I have any, and I do have some difficulty with the fact that we seem still to be struggling with what should go in there. If our goal is not either to draw upon or to inform or reform theory, then I don't think we're in the business of being scholars. We are, I think, as members of both the academy and the communities that we live in, we ought to be concerned with practice, interventions, justice, training. There are any kinds of ways in which we can make our commitments come through and hopefully be informed by what we do. To privilege a certain type of intervention or a certain type of activity as the realm of applied communication research, which is what I fear, and I fear I'm hearing at times, that really concerns me. But I think if we remind ourselves of what the goals of our research should be, which I think is always theory related, then I think we preserve the area, and then we can quibble about what applied is and what it isn't.
Bill, you had the founding words, and you'll have our final words.
Okay, thank you. It's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking it. Applied communication has always been a sloppy term. It was intended originally to be it was intended to be something that Mark did, ethnography. Actually, he was pushing ethnography at that time. It was intended when SCA started using it to be a place where people who weren't academics could come. and talk to each other and be a part of the discipline. So I would be happy if we got rid of it. To be honest with you, what I really think we need, and several people have been hinting around the edges of this, I think we need another New Orleans conference. I think we need to sit down. I think our discipline has moved beyond the activity model of the Wolbert era. It's moved beyond the behavioral model of the New Orleans conference by a long shot. But what we need to do is sit down and define, well, now who are we really at this point? What kind of scholarship are we doing? What do we specialize in? A lot of the stuff that applied people have been doing is really been taken over by the contextualized areas, the health communication folks, the organizational communication folks. They're doing that kind of scholarship. Some of it does get published in monographs. But we need to think about, how does this notion of engagement and application fit into who we are as scholars? And it is an integral part of that, and it needs to be there, but I think it needs to be done on a more disciplinary level than where we are right here.
Well, I would like to, first of all, thank all the panelists for the great participation that we had today, the great dialogue, and then let's clap for that first. And then make a plug that our business meeting is right after this. Applied Communication Division Business Meeting, Continental Ballroom C, 9:30 to 10:45. Have a great day. Thank you.